Between 2010 and 2012, the University of Montana became the center of a national conversation about sexual assault on college campuses. What began as individual reports of assault escalated into a full investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice, revealing systemic failures in how the university, local law enforcement, and the community responded to sexual violence. The case involved allegations against multiple students, including members of the university's celebrated football team. But the real scandal wasn't just about individual crimes, it was about an institution that appeared more concerned with protecting its reputation than protecting its students. This is the story of how a university's failures became a catalyst for nationwide reforms in how colleges handle sexual assault, and why the changes that resulted from Missoula continue to shape campus policies across America today.
The University of Montana sits in Missoula, a college town of about 70,000 people nestled in western Montana. The university is the community's largest employer and a source of tremendous pride, particularly its Grizzlies football team, which competes in the football championship subdivision and has a passionate following throughout the state. Like many college towns, Missoula's identity is deeply intertwined with its university. Game days bring the community together, and successful athletic programs are celebrated as collective achievements. This close relationship between town and university, while creating a strong sense of community, also made it difficult to address problems that might tarnish the institution's reputation. By 2010, reports of sexual assaults involving University of Montana students had been accumulating for years. Some involved members of the football team, others involved students from the general population. But a pattern was emerging that suggested these weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a broader cultural problem. The allegations that would eventually trigger federal intervention involved multiple reported assaults over several years. In many cases, survivors reported their assaults to university officials, campus police, or local law enforcement, only to encounter responses that seemed designed to discourage rather than support them. Several patterns emerged from these reports. Survivors described being questioned in ways that suggested skepticism about their accounts. They were asked about their drinking, their clothing, and their previous relationship with the accused. Some reported feeling that they were being treated as the problem rather than as victims of crimes. When accused students were football players or other high-profile athletes, survivors reported additional pressure. They described implicit and explicit messages that pursuing complaints could harm the team, damage the university's reputation, or make them unpopular in the community. Some survivors faced harassment from other students and community members who viewed them as troublemakers threatening the football program. The university's response to reports often seemed inadequate. Investigations were slow or incomplete. Even when investigations found that violations had occurred, sanctions were often minimal. Students found responsible for sexual misconduct might receive probations or other consequences that allowed them to remain on campus, sometimes in close proximity to the students they had harmed. Local law enforcement's handling of cases also raised concerns. The Missoula County Attorney's Office, responsible for prosecuting criminal cases, declined to file charges in numerous sexual assault cases. Prosecutors cited difficulties in proving cases beyond a reasonable doubt, particularly in situations involving alcohol or acquaintances. While these are legitimate challenges in sexual assault prosecutions, the pattern of declined prosecutions suggested a systemic reluctance to pursue these cases aggressively. In May 2012, the U.S. Department of Justice took an unprecedented step. It announced it would investigate both the University of Montana and the Missoula County Attorney's Office for potential violations of federal law in their handling of sexual assault cases. The investigation was triggered by multiple complaints from students, advocacy groups, and others who believed the university and local authorities were failing to adequately respond to sexual violence. The DOJ's involvement signaled that the problems in Missoula had reached a level that demanded federal intervention. The investigation was conducted under Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972, which prohibits sex discrimination in educational programs receiving federal funding. Courts and federal agencies have interpreted Title IX to require schools to respond appropriately to reports of sexual harassment and assault. Schools that fail to do so can be found in violation of federal law and risk losing federal funding. The DOJ investigation examined how the university responded to reports of sexual assault, whether investigations were prompt and thorough, whether sanctions were appropriate, and whether the campus climate discouraged reporting or enabled sexual misconduct to continue. Simultaneously, the DOJ investigated the Missoula County Attorney's Office under federal laws prohibiting gender discrimination in law enforcement. Investigators examined whether the office's pattern of declining to prosecute sexual assault cases constituted discrimination against female victims. The investigations were thorough and invasive, requiring the university and county to turn over extensive documentation about how they had handled sexual assault cases. Investigators interviewed students, faculty, administrators, and community members. The process was uncomfortable for the institution and the community, forcing a public reckoning with problems many had preferred to minimize or ignore. In December 2012, the Department of Justice released its findings regarding the Missoula County Attorney's Office. The report concluded that the office had engaged in a pattern of discrimination against sexual assault victims by failing to adequately investigate and prosecute cases. The DOJ found that prosecutors applied stereotyped notions about sexual assault that didn't reflect the law or the realities of these crimes. Cases were declined based on factors like victim alcohol consumption, prior relationships between victims and perpetrators, or delays in reporting, factors that, while they might affect jury perceptions, should not automatically preclude prosecution. The report also found that prosecutors failed to adequately interview witnesses, pursue corroborating evidence, or use expert testimony that could have strengthened cases. The cumulative effect was a system that routinely failed to hold perpetrators accountable and sent a message that sexual assault would not be seriously prosecuted. The findings regarding the University of Montana, released in stages throughout 2012 and 2013, were similarly damning. The DOJ found that the university had violated Title IX by failing to respond appropriately to reports of sexual harassment and assault. Specific failures included inadequate investigations that didn't gather relevant evidence or interview key witnesses, delayed responses that allowed misconduct to continue, and sanctions that were insufficient to protect victims or deter future misconduct. The university also failed to provide adequate support services for survivors and didn't have effective prevention programs to address campus sexual violence. Perhaps most significantly, the DOJ found that the university's close relationship with its athletic programs had influenced its response to cases involving athletes. There was evidence that some cases involving football players received different treatment than cases involving other students, with investigations being less thorough and sanctions being more lenient. The federal investigation and its findings had immediate and far-reaching consequences. Several high-ranking university officials, including the president, resigned or were forced out. The athletic director also departed. These changes signaled that the problems were being taken seriously at the highest levels. The university entered into a resolution agreement with the Department of Justice, committing to comprehensive reforms in how it handled sexual assault and harassment. These reforms included completely revising investigation procedures to ensure thoroughness and promptness, hiring additional staff with specialized training in sexual assault response, implementing new training programs for students, faculty, and staff, establishing clear, consistent sanctions for sexual misconduct, creating better support services for survivors, developing prevention programs to address campus culture. The Missoula County Attorney's Office also entered into a resolution agreement requiring significant changes in how sexual assault cases were prosecuted. The office committed to specialized training for prosecutors, new protocols for case evaluation and investigation, and regular monitoring by the DOJ to ensure compliance. Beyond these institutional changes, the case had a profound impact on the Missoula community. It forced uncomfortable conversations about how the community had enabled a culture that protected perpetrators and silenced survivors. Community members had to confront the reality that their pride in the university and its football team had sometimes blinded them to serious problems. The scandal and resulting reforms fundamentally changed the culture at the University of Montana. Students who had felt unsupported and disbelieved when they reported assaults began to see that their experiences were being taken seriously. the message that sexual assault would not be tolerated started to take hold. However, the changes also generated controversy. Some students and community members felt the pendulum had swung too far, arguing that accused students were now presumed guilty and denied fair treatment. They worried that allegations alone could destroy reputations and academic careers, even when evidence was ambiguous or contradictory. This tension reflects broader national debates about how to balance the rights of survivors with the rights of the accused, and how to ensure both fair processes and adequate protection against sexual violence. These debates continue on campuses across the country. Support services for survivors improved significantly following the reforms. The university established a dedicated office with trained advocates who could help survivors navigate reporting options, access medical care and counseling, and understand their rights. These services operated independently of the investigation process, ensuring survivors could get help regardless of whether they chose to file formal complaints. Prevention education also became more comprehensive. All incoming students received training about consent, bystander intervention, and resources available if they or someone they knew experienced sexual violence. Athletes received additional specialized training acknowledging the particular responsibilities and risks associated with their high-profile status. The University of Montana case became a touchstone in national discussions about campus sexual assault. The DOJ used the resolution agreement with the university as a template, issuing guidance to colleges and universities nationwide about their obligations under Title IX. This guidance, often referred to as the blueprint, outlined expectations for how institutions should respond to reports of sexual violence. It addressed timelines for investigations, standards of evidence, interim measures to protect complainants, training requirements, and prevention efforts. Schools across the country revised their policies to align with this guidance. The case also contributed to broader awareness about the prevalence of sexual assault on college campuses. Advocacy organizations used Montana as an example of how institutional failures enable sexual violence to continue. Survivors nationwide found validation in seeing a major institution held accountable for its failures. In 2011, the Department of Education had already issued a Dear Colleague letter reminding schools of their Title IX obligations regarding sexual violence. The Montana case provided concrete examples of what violations looked like and what effective reforms required. Together, these developments ushered in a new era of campus sexual assault policy. However, these changes also generated significant controversy. Critics argued that the lower standard of evidence used in campus proceedings, preponderance of evidence rather than beyond a reasonable doubt, was unfair to accused students. They worried about inadequate due process protections and the consequences of findings that, while not criminal convictions, could still devastate academic and professional prospects. These debates intensified over subsequent years, with the Trump administration later rescinding some Obama-era guidance and issuing new regulations that emphasized due process protections. The Biden administration has since proposed revisions that attempt to balance survivor support with procedural fairness. The University of Montana case remains relevant to these ongoing policy discussions. More than a decade after the scandal, the University of Montana continues operating under reformed policies for addressing sexual misconduct. The institution has maintained its commitment to the changes implemented as part of the DOJ resolution agreement, even as federal guidance has evolved. The university regularly reports data on sexual misconduct complaints, investigations, and outcomes, transparency that was lacking before the scandal. While sexual assault remains a problem on campus, as it does at virtually all colleges and universities, the institution's response is dramatically different than it was in 2010 to 2012. The Missoula County Attorney's Office has also maintained reforms in how it handles sexual assault prosecutions. While challenges remain in securing convictions in these difficult cases, the office's approach is more victim-centered and thorough than it was before the DOJ intervention. The cultural changes in Missoula have been more gradual. The community has had to reconcile its pride in the university with acknowledgement of serious failures. Conversations about sexual assault, consent, and institutional accountability that were once avoided are now more common, though still sometimes uncomfortable. The University of Montana case illustrates several important lessons about institutional responses to sexual violence. First, it demonstrates how institutional priorities can conflict with student safety. When protecting reputation or athletic programs becomes more important than protecting students, the institution fails its fundamental mission. Second, the case shows how cultural factors influence institutional responses. In a community where the football team is deeply valued, there can be pressure, explicit or implicit, to minimize problems involving team members. Breaking through this culture requires acknowledging it exists and implementing structural changes that prevent it from influencing outcomes. Third, the case highlights the importance of specialized training and expertise in responding to sexual violence. Campus officials and law enforcement who lack understanding of trauma, sexual assault dynamics, and best practices in investigation will inevitably make mistakes that harm survivors and undermine accountability. Finally, the case demonstrates that federal oversight can drive institutional change. While universities and law enforcement agencies should proactively address sexual violence, sometimes external pressure is necessary to force institutions to confront problems they would prefer to ignore. However, the case also raises difficult questions that remain unresolved. How do we balance supporting survivors with ensuring fair treatment of the accused? How do we address sexual violence effectively while respecting due process? How do we change campus cultures that enable sexual misconduct without creating environments where accusations alone destroy reputations? These questions continue to challenge colleges, universities, and communities nationwide. The University of Montana rape scandal represents a critical moment in how American society addresses sexual violence on college campuses. What happened in Missoula, both the failures and the reforms, has influenced policy and practice at institutions across the country. The case reminds us that sexual assault is not just an individual crime but a community issue that requires institutional and cultural responses. When institutions fail to take sexual violence seriously, when they prioritize other concerns over student safety, they enable harm to continue and compound the trauma survivors experience. The survivors who came forward despite tremendous pressure and skepticism demonstrated remarkable courage. Their willingness to report what happened to them, to persist when they weren't believed, and to participate in investigations even when doing so was painful ultimately led to changes that have protected countless other students. The University of Montana case is not just about what went wrong. It's about what can happen when institutions are held accountable and choose to do better. While challenges remain and debates continue about the best approaches to campus sexual violence, the fundamental lesson is clear. Institutions have an obligation to create safe environments and respond effectively when students are harmed. The consequences of failing that obligation, both for individual survivors and for the institution itself, are severe and far-reaching.